There are 3 empty chairs at the front of my own wedding, and I am the only one who knows whose names are on them. I am standing at the back of a rented hall in my borrowed dress, holding a bouquet that's already wilting in my hands, and I am staring at the place cards I wrote myself, Mum, Dad, Ashley, propped on seats that will stay empty all night, no call, no text, no flowers. Just the slow understanding, arriving right there in the middle of my vows, that my family looked at the most important day of my life and decided it wasn't worth the drive. My name is Nell Carter, and I was 38 years old the day I learned that being unwanted can happen quietly, in a room full of people who love you anyway. Before I take you any further, I want to know who I'm sitting with today. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. A small town, a big city, somewhere far across the ocean. I read every single one, and it always amazes me how far these stories travel. And I mean this honestly, how are you doing today? If life has felt heavy lately, if you've been carrying something nobody else seems to notice, then pull your chair a little closer. This story is for you. If you believe the people who get overlooked deserve their moment too, do me a small kindness and subscribe. This little corner of the internet is for everyone who was underestimated and lived long enough to prove them wrong. Now, let me take you back, because the empty chairs were never really the beginning. They were just the first time everyone else could see it. I should tell you, before you decide who I am, that I am not a bitter woman. I want you to understand that from the start, because the story I'm about to share could sound like revenge if you squint at it the wrong way. It isn't. It's about what happens when a family quietly decides that one daughter matters, and the other one is simply there. Useful when convenient, invisible the rest of the time. It's about my younger sister, Ashley, who never once heard the word no, and about me, who learned not to ask. For most of my life I told myself I was imagining it. The unequal birthdays, the borrowed money that never came back, the way my good news was always met with a change of subject. But I wasn't imagining it, and standing in that hall, watching Jake's grandmother reach over and squeeze my hand because no one from my own blood would, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter and far more dangerous. Clarity. For years I had kept every letter, every receipt, every little proof that I existed, because no one else would ever vouch for me. I didn't know yet that those careful habits, the ones my family laughed at, were about to become the thing that brought the whole story into the light. I just knew, as I said my vows to a good man in front of 3 empty chairs, that I was done waiting to be chosen. They thought skipping my wedding was the end of me. They had no idea it was only the beginning of everything they were about to lose. And it started, like most family stories do, a very long time ago, long before the dress, the hall, and those 3 empty chairs nobody bothered to fill. By the way, Ashley arrived 4 years after me, and from the moment she did, I understood that our house ran on 2 different sets of rules. Hers were simple, she could do no wrong. Mine were simpler still, I could do no right loudly. When Ashley threw a tantrum in the grocery store, my mother called it spirit. When I asked, quietly and politely, for a new pair of shoes because mine had a hole in them, my mother called it ungrateful. I learned the math of our family early. There was a budget, and there was Ashley, and whatever was left over after Ashley came to me, if anything came at all. I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds. I'm not describing monsters. My parents, Brenda and Gary Carter, were ordinary people who loved telling the neighbors about their 2 girls. They just only ever meant one of them when they said how proud they were. I remember my 10th birthday more clearly than I'd like. I'd asked for a small party, just a few girls from school and a cake. What I got was a reminder that Ashley had a recital that same afternoon, so we'd celebrate me afterward. Quickly, once the important thing was done, we never did get to it. By evening everyone was tired, and my mother said we'd make it up to me, which was a promise I would hear in 100 different shapes over the years, and never once see kept. I didn't cry. I'd already learned that crying was just more evidence of how dramatic I was. By the time I was 15, I had a job bagging groceries after school, and Ashley had a car with a bow on it for her 16th birthday. I paid for my own braces in installments I tracked in a little notebook. I filled out my own college applications at the kitchen table, while my mother helped Ashley pick a prom dress in the next room. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because it taught me a habit that would matter more than I could have guessed. I kept records. Every paycheck, every receipt, every birthday card with a check folded inside. Not because I was suspicious, but because in a house where my version of events was always the wrong one, the paper was the only thing that ever agreed with me. I grew quiet and watchful, the way you do when nobody is keeping score on your behalf. Ashley grew loud and certain, the way you do when the whole world keeps telling you that you're the favorite. 2 daughters, 1 house, raised by the same 2 people into completely different lives. The cruelty in a family like mine is never the loud kind. It's small enough to deny and constant enough to shape you. It's being seated at the kids' table at 26 while Ashley and her husband, Brad, took the good chairs. It's the $400 I lent my father that somehow became a gift the moment I mentioned it again. It's watching an idea I'd shared at Thanksgiving come out of Ashley's mouth at Christmas, polished and praised, while I sat there wondering if I dreamed saying it first. And whenever I noticed any of it out loud, there was the family's favorite phrase, the one that ended every conversation before it could begin. "Why are you being so dramatic, Nell?" I heard it so many times that I started saying it to myself, swallowing the question before anyone else could. That is how they trained me to be quiet. Not with anything you could point to. With 1,000 small things you could always be talked out of. The one person who ever saw me clearly was my grandmother, Ruth. She'd slip me a folded 20 when no one was looking and tell me I noticed things other people missed, like it was a gift instead of a burden. "Keep that," she'd say. "You'll need it someday." I thought she meant the money. I kept her cards too, tucked in the box with my receipts. I didn't understand yet that her handwriting would one day matter more than anything else I owned. So at 28, I did the quietest thing I had ever done. I left. I took a job 2 states away and told my family I'd found a good opportunity, which was true, even if the real opportunity was distance. For the first time, nobody compared me to anyone. I built a small, honest life, and a few years into it, I met Jake Bennett. He was steady in a way I wasn't used to, the kind of man who listened to my whole sentence before answering. The first time I told him about Ashley's car and my notebook of installments, he didn't say I was being dramatic. He just got quiet, and then he said it wasn't fair, and I nearly cried at how strange it felt to be believed. We started a little business together and made it work. And here is the part that still aches. Even then, even happy, even chosen for once, I kept hoping. When we set a date and I mailed those invitations home, I told myself this time would be different. I really did believe they would come. I called my mother the night Jake proposed, before I called anyone else, because some part of me still wanted her to be the first to know. I can still hear the pause on the line, that little breath she took before deciding how to feel about my good news. "Well," she finally said, "does he know what he's getting into?" I laughed it off, the way I'd learned to laugh off everything. Ashley was less subtle. She called me back an hour later, not to say congratulations, but to ask whether I wasn't maybe settling, since I'd waited so long. My father's contribution, when it came, was that weddings were a waste of money and he hoped we weren't expecting help. I wasn't. I never had been. But here is the contrast I want you to sit with, because it's the whole story in miniature. In the same breath my parents called my wedding frivolous, they were already discussing how much they'd contribute to Ashley's anniversary party that fall. A party. For an anniversary. Worth more than their own daughter's marriage. I sent real invitations. Not an email, not a text, but heavy cream cards I addressed by hand at my kitchen table. The same table where I'd once filled out college applications alone. I mailed 3 of them home and told myself a paper invitation was harder to ignore than a phone call. Then I waited. A week passed with no reply. 2 weeks. I called, and the calls went to voicemail, and the voicemails went unanswered. When my mother finally picked up, she was breezy. "Oh, we'll try to make it, honey, we'll see how things shake out." I asked her to just tell me yes or no so I could give the cat her account. She said I was putting pressure on her. Meanwhile, Ashley posted photos online of a beach trip she and Brad were planning, and the dates, when I checked them twice to be sure, landed squarely on my wedding weekend. I told myself it was a coincidence. I added 3 seats to the final count anyway, and I paid for a special meal for my parents, the dinner my mother liked, just in case. That is the thing about hope. It keeps spending money long after the truth has stopped answering the phone. The morning of the wedding, I checked my phone before I checked the mirror. Nothing. No text wishing me well, no call asking what time to arrive, no flowers waiting at the venue with a card. I got dressed in a gown I'd bought secondhand and made beautiful, and I told myself they'd simply show up, the way you tell yourself anything to get through a doorway. They didn't. I walked into those 3 chairs at the front, the place cards standing like little white headstones, and I understood all at once and for good. There would be no last-minute car pulling into the lot. No breathless apology. Just absence, dressed up and given a seat, somewhere in the middle of my vows, when I should have been looking only at Jake. My eyes drifted to those empty chairs, and I felt the whole congregation feel it with me. And then something happened that I will carry to my last day. Jake's grandmother, Joan, a woman I had known for 2 years, reached across the aisle and took my hand, and held it like she'd been waiting her whole life to. The people who shared my blood couldn't be bothered to drive. The woman who shared none of it refused to let me stand there alone. I smiled for the photographs. I danced with my husband and thanked every guest who showed up, and not one of them was named Carter. Underneath the music, a single thought kept turning over in me, quiet and clear. These were the same people who had taught me to keep my receipts. I just didn't know yet what I was about to start keeping them for. I let a few days pass before I called home. I wanted to be calm, and I wanted to hear them say it out loud. My mother answered like nothing had happened, asking how the honeymoon was. When I finally asked why none of them came, she sighed, the sigh I'd heard my whole life. It just wasn't a priority, Eleanor. You know how things are. Then, almost cheerfully, she delivered the line I have never been able to unhear. Besides, we were saving the trip for something that actually matters. Ashley's plans, you understand. My father, in the background, added that they'd figured I wouldn't really mind, since I'd always been the independent one. I sat there with the phone against my ear and felt something close inside me, quietly like a door. Not rage. I'd spent 38 years being told my rage was drama. This was colder and steadier than that. For the first time in my life, I stopped asking these people to love me, and I started very quietly to pay attention. For 2 years after the wedding, I did something my family never noticed, because they were never looking. I built something. Jake and I had started a small business out of our spare room, and slowly, carefully, it grew into something real. I'm not going to pretend it made us rich. It made us steady, which after the life I'd had felt like the same thing. I kept the books myself, the way I'd always kept everything. Every invoice logged, every contract filed, every figure where I could find it again. While Ashley posted photographs of a lifestyle I would later learn she couldn't actually afford, I quietly became the kind of woman who understood how money really moves. How it's titled, how it's transferred, how a signature on the right page can change who owns what. None of that knowledge felt important at the time. It just felt like competence, the unglamorous skill of a woman used to taking care of herself. I didn't know I was training for anything. But the quiet daughter, the one they'd dismissed her whole life, was becoming fluent in exactly the language her family least wanted her to read. The call came on a Tuesday. My mother's voice, warm in a way it only ever was when she needed something. Gary had collapsed at the hardware store, she said, his heart, and while he was recovering, the family thought it was time to finally sort out the estate. Suddenly I was wanted. Suddenly there were we and us and family again. She mentioned, almost in passing, your grandmother's house, the one Ruth had left in a trust years ago, the one I remembered being told would partly come to me someday. Now my mother spoke about it like a loose end to tidy up. We just need everyone on the same page, she said. Come help us sort the paperwork. I almost laughed. For 2 years I hadn't been worth a phone call, and now I was family because there were documents that needed signatures. But I didn't say any of that. I said yes. I said I'd love to help. Because somewhere under that sudden warmth I heard something I recognized. The particular brightness people use when they're hoping you won't look too closely. And I had spent my whole life learning to look closely. So I asked one simple question before we hung up. Which paperwork, exactly? They sent me a stack of documents to review, and I think they assumed I'd skim them the way a grateful, eager daughter would, just grateful to be included. Instead, I spread them across my kitchen table next to the box I had kept since childhood, the one with Grandma Ruth's cards and my old receipts, and I started comparing. I pulled the county property records too, which anyone can access if they know to look. And the first thing that didn't fit was the deed to Ruth's house. I remembered the house being held in her trust, with the 3 of us named to share it. But the current deed told a different story. The property had been transferred out of the trust 2 years earlier, and the new owner listed was Ashley. Not the family, not the estate, Ashley alone. I sat very still for a moment. Then I checked the date. And the date was the part that made my stomach turn, because it was right around the time Ruth had gotten sick, the months when she could barely remember what day it was, let alone sign away a house. I told myself there had to be an explanation. I'm a careful person. I don't accuse, I verify. So I kept reading, and the deeper I went, the worse it got. I took everything to a lawyer named Susan Walsh, an estate attorney with 30 years behind her and no patience for nonsense. I expected her to tell me I was reading too much into it. She didn't. She laid the papers out and went quiet, and then she started pointing. The transfer, she explained, had been made using a power of attorney, one my father had signed on Ruth's behalf. That can be perfectly legal, she said, but only if it's used in the person's interest, and selling a house out from under a trust to a single grandchild was not that. Then she found the purchase price. The house, worth nearly $300,000, had been transferred to Ashley for the sum of $1. Other consideration, the document called it. There was no other consideration. There was a sick old woman, a son with her power of attorney, and a favorite grandchild who suddenly owned a house. Susan tapped the trust amendment last. It had been changed 5 weeks after Ruth's dementia diagnosis. The diagnosis I found in the medical records the family had helpfully included without realizing what it proved. Everything I had been raised to call drama was sitting on that table in black and white. And none of it was an accident. Susan told me not to act in anger, and I didn't have to. Anger wasn't what I felt anymore. What I felt was thorough. Over the next few weeks, I built a file, the kind of file a lifetime of keeping receipts had prepared me to build. I had the original trust, the one that named all 3 of us. I had the amended version, signed after the diagnosis. I had the deed showing the dollar sale, the medical records dating Ruth's decline, and the power of attorney my father had used. And then there was the piece that mattered most to me, the one that wasn't about law at all. A letter, in Grandma Ruth's own handwriting, sent to me years before she got sick, telling me the house should always be a place all her grandchildren could come home to, and that she was counting on me, the careful one, to make sure of it. I had kept that letter in my box for over a decade, never knowing it would become the truest evidence of what she'd actually wanted. Susan also tracked down the notary, a man named Tom Reyes, whose records didn't match the dates on the amendment at all. I had it all now, lawful and complete. And I made one decision that surprised even me. I would not confront them in private, where they could lie and call me dramatic one final time. I would do it where they could not. And I knew exactly where. It was the chance came 3 weeks later, at a party for my father's recovery. It was a large gathering, the kind my family loved, with aunts and uncles and cousins and neighbors, filling my parents' living room, all of them holding glasses of wine and the version of events they'd been told for years. To most of that room, I was the difficult daughter, the one who'd skipped family obligations and kept her distance, the cold one. Nobody there knew I'd been kept at a distance, not the other way around. Ashley held court near the fireplace, in a dress that cost more than my first car, telling a story that had everyone laughing. Brad refilled glasses. My mother moved through the room like a woman who had everything under control, and I walked in quietly the way I always had, with Jake beside me and a plain folder in my bag. No one paid me much attention. They never had. That was about to be the most expensive mistake any of them had ever made. For a while, I just stood and listened. I let them have their evening. Then Ashley, glass in hand, decided to include me the way she always did, with a little joke at my expense. She said it was nice that I'd finally shown up to something, since I was so famous for not coming to family events. The room chuckled. A cousin near me smirked. And I felt the old reflex rise up, the one that told me to laugh it off, to swallow it, to be small. Instead, I set down my drink, and I stood up straight, and I said, in a voice that was perfectly calm, "That's funny, Ashley, coming from the people who couldn't make it to my wedding." The room went still in a way you could feel on your skin. My mother's smile froze. I thanked everyone for coming, and then I said I had something the family had been avoiding for a very long time, and that it was time we all looked at it together. Nobody told me I was being dramatic. For the first time in my life, in a room full of the people who'd trained me to be quiet, every single one of them was waiting to hear what the quiet one had to say. I opened the folder. I didn't raise my voice because I didn't need to. I told them I'd been asked to help sort out the estate and that I had. I held up the original trust, the one Grandma Ruth had written, naming all three of us. Then I held up the amended version, signed 5 weeks after her dementia diagnosis, and I read the date out loud, slowly so everyone could hear it. I showed them the deed, the one that sold a $300,000 house to Ashley for a single dollar. I let that number sit in the room, $1. And then, because some things deserve to be heard in the person's own words, I read a few lines from Ruth's letter, the one in her handwriting, about the house being a home for all her grandchildren, and about her counting on me to make sure of it. I watched the faces change. I watched my aunts turn toward my mother, waiting for the denial that would explain all of this away. It didn't come, because there was no explaining it. The family narrative, the one where I was the cold, difficult daughter and they were the loving family I'd abandoned, simply could not survive contact with the paper in my hands. Every receipt I'd ever been mocked for keeping had been leading, all along, to this. It was Ashley who broke first. The charm she'd worn her whole life slipped right off her face, and what was underneath wasn't sorrow. It was fury at being caught. She told me I had no idea what it had been like, that she was the one who'd stayed, the one who'd dealt with everything while I was off playing house in another state. She said Grandma had wanted her to have it, as if saying it loudly enough would make a document say something it didn't. And in defending herself, in front of every aunt and cousin in that room, she admitted she'd known exactly what she was signing. My mother reached for the old script, the one that had worked on me for 38 years. After everything we've done for you, she started, you come into our home and do this. But the room had already shifted. People were looking at the papers, not at me. My father said nothing at all. He just sat in his recliner, grave-faced, finally understanding that the daughter they'd treated as disposable was the only one who'd kept the receipts. I closed the folder. I told them calmly that the matter was now with my attorney, and that I'd let the law decide what fairness looked like. Then I picked up my bag. I wasn't finished. I was only just beginning. The truth did what truth usually does once it's out of the box. It spread, quietly, on its own. I didn't have to make a single phone call. Within days, the aunts who'd believed I was the cold one were calling me, lowering their voices, telling me they'd always sensed something was off. My cousin Megan, the one who'd smirked at the party, sent a long message apologizing for years of assumptions she'd never questioned. I didn't gloat, and I didn't gather them up as allies. I'd lived too long without their belief to suddenly need it now. The harder fallout landed on Ashley, the lifestyle she'd performed online, the trips and the dinners and the dress that cost more than my first car, turned out to be propped up against a house that was never really hers. As word moved through the family, and the legal letters began to arrive, the invitations to her stopped, the borrowed shine wore off, and the woman who'd spent her whole life being adored found out how quickly a crowd thins when the story changes. Nobody called her dramatic. They just stopped calling. The legal part took the better part of a year, the way these things really do. There were no dramatic courtroom speeches, just filings, depositions, and the slow, patient weight of evidence that couldn't be argued with. Susan petitioned to void the transfer, on the grounds that the power of attorney had been misused while Ruth lacked the capacity to consent. The notary's mismatched records didn't help my family's case, and neither did Ashley's own words at that party, which more than one relative was willing to repeat. In the end, the court set aside the dollar sale and the amended trust, and Ruth's true wishes were restored. The house went back into the trust, to be shared the way she'd written it down all those years ago. Ashley was ordered to account for what she'd taken, and my father's role in signing it away followed him into every conversation that came after. It wasn't revenge. It was just the law, finally catching up to a truth I'd been carrying alone. My mother called me, months later, after the dust settled. She was crying. She said now that the house was sorted out, maybe we could put all of this behind us, maybe we could be a family again. And I want to be honest with you, because this is the part people always get wrong. I didn't scream at her. I didn't have a single thing left to prove. I just told her the truth, gently, which is harder than anger ever was. I said I forgave them, because I wasn't willing to carry it anymore, but that forgiveness and pretending are not the same thing. You taught me I wasn't a priority, I told her. I finally believed you. There was a long silence on the line. She wanted the easy version, the hug that erases everything, the holiday where we all agree not to mention it. I didn't give her that. Some doors, once they close quietly, are meant to stay closed. These days, my life is quiet in the way I always wanted it to be. Jake and I still run our little business. The house went into the trust, and once a year it fills with the cousins and second cousins Ruth wanted there, the children she'd hoped would always have a place to come home to. On a shelf in my own home, I keep two things framed side by side: the corrected deed and Grandma Ruth's letter in her own handwriting. Not as trophies. As proof that I was telling the truth all along. I think now about those 3 empty chairs at my wedding, and they don't hurt the way they used to. Because I understand what they really were. Not the day my family abandoned me. The day I stopped waiting to be chosen, and started choosing myself. If your family ever made you feel small, hear me. Your quiet is not your weakness. And your day always comes. Thank you for sitting with me. Stay, and I'll tell you another.